Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
And our speaker today, Paula Gravelle. She's the executive director of the New York State Council of Churches. She's a former director of pastoral care at Ellis Hospital. She used to teach over at Maria in the bereavement studies. She's on all kinds of boards and committees that are way too long to get into here. Yes. So she's going to tell us about this book, The Good Funeral, a book with two authors, Thomas Long and Thomas Lynch.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. It's really good to be able to be here with you today and share this. First of all, I'm an avid reader, so when Joe called, I didn't even really have to think about it in terms of, he said, would you do this? But this is my first time to be in this group and to do this with you, so thank you for coming and being here. This book, The Good Funeral, like Joe said, is written by two authors. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't when you have two authors. These two men are very mutually supportive of one another. Thomas Lynch is a funeral director. Yes, he's done a PBS series, he's a poet, and he's really committed to his work. And he really sees his work as a funeral director as a calling. That's his background. And in the first chapter of the book, he talks a lot about his Irish Catholic upbringing and how his family thought he might be a priest and instead realized that being a funeral director truly was his calling. His co-author is a Presbyterian minister named Thomas Long, and he is a professor at Emory University in their Candler School of Theology. These men met when they were on their circuits, Thomas Lynch talking about funerals, and Thomas Long has always done work and writing on grief and that type of thing. And he talks about a little bit about his background in the first two chapters of the book. The book is accessible to all people. They would tell you that they wrote it for funeral directors and clergy to be able to learn how to work together better in this business and how to guide people who are facing funerals in their families. However, as I read it, I realized it really is accessible to everybody. We are all going to be in positions, if we haven't been already, in terms of planning funerals, working with a funeral director, if we have a religious background, working with our clergy to help us put a funeral together. And some of what is talked about in this book certainly would be advantageous in that. That said, however, this book is not a book about grief. So if you're someone who's looking for a book that talks more about the processes of grief and what's going on, this would not be the book for you. In fact, their section on grief is the shortest section in the book. It's at the very end, and they each write about 3 pages about it. So that's very brief. What the book does is it's a discussion on the current state of the funeral. Both of these authors would say that the funeral is spiraling down and that the real meaning of a funeral has been lost. That is really the premise of their book, and the bias for that comes through very strongly as they write and as they are in dialogue with each other. The book is broken up into 5 sections, and they each write 2 chapters, or they each write a chapter in each section, so the sections are 2 chapters long. And just to give you a feel for that, the first heading is why we do this. And those first 2 chapters just tell you about the men. They give you their history, some of their family background, some of the reasons why they've gone into the work they've gone into and what it means to them. The second section is called Caring for the Dead. And this is where they start really talking about the importance of the funeral, what it means to have a body present. And you'll start getting the flavor in this section of how concerned they are that funerals seem to be going the way of memorial services or celebrations of life. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. I also think that section is the strongest section in the book, chapters 3 and 4. I really think that that's their best work. The next section is on funeral directors and clergy, and quite frankly, I don't think they held tight during that section. It was like Thomas Lynch was a fan club for Thomas Long, and Thomas Long was a fan club for Thomas Lynch, and it was their mutual appreciation society. And when I was reading it, sometimes I really felt like I was intruding on a private, heads up boys, we're doing good here kind of conversation. That said, there still was some good points in it and interesting to read about what's meaningful for them. Chapters 7 and 8 are entitled The Funeral. And chapter 7 is about cremation. And so I will talk a little bit about that too in terms of the book. And then the final section, chapters 9 and 10, is about grieving. And like I said, that between the two of them, that's 6 pages long. So the book really is not about that. So what the book does is it looks at challenges, what they see is a good funeral, and how society is taking what they perceive to be a good funeral and kind of knocking the wind right out of that. They say that the challenges to a good funeral are the commercial aspects of what happens at a funeral, the relationships between funeral directors and clergy, the exclusion of the body from the service, and the rapid growth in cremation. Let me talk a little bit about the whole issue of the body, because that is really, if in this book, that is really what they are pushing and saying far too often in this day and age, funerals are a celebration of life without the guest of honor present. That people are moving more and more toward memorial services with no body there, that they are becoming so personalized that it's like a total celebration of life and not giving the people a chance to grieve, not acknowledging that a human being has died, and that means there's been a loss in society, and we don't honor that. And they both talk about how that's really a phenomena in the United States, among white middle-class Americans, Protestants more than other denominations, and they say a big reason for that is the whole issue of convenience. That people don't have a service in a church and walk with the casket out of the church into a graveyard, because the graveyards aren't attached to churches anymore. They have to get in a car and travel. And so it becomes a matter of convenience and cost and time, and people are trying to consolidate this whole process. And they feel that what is getting lost in that really is the acknowledgement that a funeral is about getting the body where it needs to go. In fact, the line that they use throughout the book is that they say the real obligation of a funeral is to get the dead where they need to go and the living where they need to be. If you really stop and think about that, it's really pretty powerful to get the dead where they need to go. So in that, for them, is the whole respect of the body, the fact that the funeral has to be a process, a procession, a journey from one place to another, and that for the living, it has to help us to come to grips with our new status. When I've worked with parents who have lost children, one of the most heartrending things I hear is a mom saying to me, "Am I still a mom?" And so a funeral helps us look at what is our status now that this person that we've loved or cared about is no longer physically present with us. It raises some good issues about that. And that plays into the whole thing of cremation. Neither of these authors are against cremation. What they are against is the fact that cremation is a very private thing that happens. They talk about how sometimes the funeral director will go to the hospital or where the person has died, receive the body, and take the body immediately to the crematorium. There's no ritual, there's no acknowledgement or service that surrounds that movement. And Thomas Lynch especially, he's the funeral director, he would say that he really believes that if you're going to have a cremation, you need to process with that body to the crematory. Otherwise, it's too sanitized, it's not showing respect to the person who has died, and you can almost pretend that it doesn't happen. Okay, so they don't make judgments in here about cremation. As I was reading it, my sense was that their bias is toward not having a cremation, or that if you're going to have a cremation, that you have a viewing with the body first and then have a cremation. He does talk very clearly, the reason some people say, no, we're not going to do that is because of the added cost. For many people, they say cremation is a way that we can care for the earth as well as care for our loved one who doesn't need their body anymore. And so why should we pay all the money for the extra steps? The other piece about that, when Thomas Long talks about it, he's the clergy person, he talks about how too often religious people get into this whole thing of body versus spirit. And he says the reality is we are embodied souls, and so our bodies do have relevance and meaning and need to be treated with respect. And he would argue with anyone who would say, oh, my body's just a container. Once I've died, the soul is gone. I don't need the body anymore. It's worthless. He would say, well, there's some truth to the fact that you don't need your body anymore, but it's not worthless. It contained who you were, and it needs to be treated with respect. So it raises some very interesting issues along those lines. I've taught an bereavement studies program for a number of years, and I have to say it really did make me think in terms of, okay, what have I been teaching, and what are these two men opening my eyes to in terms of how funerals progress and that type of thing. They are very open to criticizing themselves. So Thomas Lynch especially, any of you who know him or have read any of his writings know that he, if not anything else, is a man of deep integrity and real insight. And so he will question the tactics of funeral directors. That he feels that many of the casket companies want funeral directors to become their salespeople. And they say that sometimes there's such a bad taste in people's mouths about funeral directors because they feel that here we are at our most vulnerable time. Someone we love very much has died, and we go in and the first thing you're trying to do is sell us things. So he's very verbal about that in his book, and saying that the funeral industry has to reclaim what they will and won't do. He said he's not against having to offer people caskets. That's part of it. But if that's the first thing that happens when you enter into a funeral home, there's something wrong. So he really has a lot to say about that. Both of these men really use Jessica Mitford's book. Her book was The American Way of Death. It was published in 1963 and then republished in 1998. And they are really trying to offer a counterpoint to everything that she offered. Her premise basically was that the whole funeral industry is one big scam and that it's too morbid. So you really don't need a body there. You really don't need this sad service. You need to get on with life and go forward. And both of these men are very adamant that that is not the way to go. So there's a lot of quotes about her in this book, and about looking at why she wrote what she wrote and who she was and what was honest and what was not from their point of view. And so even Thomas Lynch would say she raised some interesting issues that the funeral industry had to look at, because it is issues of cost and how we invite people in and share with them. So that was a big thing. And they also, in that chapter, when they're talking a lot about the cost, they also talk about pre-planning and what that could mean for families. Here is what they're against. They're against the pre-planning that happens, and the way they write it is really delightful. You're sitting down to dinner and the telephone rings, and it's, hello, hi, I'm Maggie with Funerals of America, and I want to talk to you about the end of your life or your loved ones, and how it's a big corporation that's calling and saying, you know, you could purchase a casket, you can do this, and you can ease the burden from your family. Thomas Lynch does a wonderful piece in the book about how it's okay that when he dies, he's a burden to his kids, because his kids have been a burden to him for a lot of his life. That he loves them dearly, but being a burden to one another is part of living and loving and growing together. He said, I have no concerns or issues about that. If I'm a burden after I'm dead to them, oh well, they'll have to deal with it and move forward. He is all for prearranging when it's done at a local level, when you know the funeral director, when it's a home that you're almost 100% sure that that's where you're going to work out of. And he said you need to be careful, though, because you don't want to plan it to have all the I's dotted and T's crossed, because part of the process of grieving is working with and planning and looking at what might be a meaningful funeral for the person that you have loved who has since died. There's also, you can find many studies out there that have shown that the pre-planning really benefits the funeral homes more than it benefits the families. There's lots of little clauses there, and if you think you're going to move, you probably shouldn't do it. My mother was residing in Florida, and she wanted to be real helpful to us as her children who didn't live in Florida. And so she went to a funeral home, very reputable, but paid money and bought a casket and then bought a funeral service kind of thing. However, she got sick, and I brought her up here, and she died in Albany. So it was a very interesting thing. We were able to get the casket that she had ordered. That was all paid for, but we lost about she lost about $2,000 because the funeral wasn't going to be at that home there. So there's caveats both ways. I think one of the positive things about talking about pre-planning is it means we're talking. Death has become one of those topics. If you bring it up at a cocktail party, everybody's going to walk away from you. They say how you don't talk about death or money with other people. And really, we need to be able to talk about this openly in our society and in ourselves, and look at what the death of people we love means in our lives, and then ultimately what our own death will mean in our lives. Part of the premise of this book is that you can tell a lot about a society based on how they deal with their dead. And that if you don't care for the bodies of the dead, you're not going to be really good at caring for the living. That could probably be a 3-hour debate, but it is a premise in their book in terms of how they're looking at this and the direction that they're hoping to go. Thomas Long, obviously the clergy person, has some things to say about the funerals themselves, feeling that many people now don't really want a funeral that really acknowledges the solemnity of the death. They're looking for celebration. They're looking for, let's remember this person's life and focus on that. There is a place for that, and both of these gentlemen would say the place for that is after the funeral. That the funeral is the place where you acknowledge the fact that a human being has died and that this has meaning. And this is sad. Even when there's feelings of relief because the person has been suffering or ill or that type of thing, there's still a solemnity that has to go along with that. Thomas Long would say that many clergy are selling out on that. When they meet with a family, they'll say, well, what would your mother want? And they talk about having all her it can get pretty caustic sometimes, cynical the way they're talking about things, talking about having their trinkets all over the place so that you can look at them and that's how you're going to remember them, when really the stories of the heart are the real remembrance. So they don't go for that. Now again, Thomas Lynch would be very clear in terms of saying, I believe in funerals that are personal, but all the personalizing doesn't have to happen. So for example, he would be against a casket that has trout on the end of it. You know, a casket so personalized because the person was a fisherman and that's what they loved. He would say, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to spend the money for that? It's becoming so personalized that you don't realize that death is a human. We're all going to die. We're all going to deal with death in our life. Each funeral is personal because it's about that person who has died. So even if the same scripture is read as was read 2 days previously for another death, it's personal because it's about that person. They would both say that you need to tell stories of the person who has died, but that the funeral also has to acknowledge what this death means in the larger picture of humanity. The other piece that they talk about a lot, again, as I said when I began, is about the journey, and that funerals have to be a procession, and that the people have to be involved. He said, when you go to a funeral, you need to be there to participate, not to sit back and, they don't say the word be entertained, but they don't want you to be an audience. They want you to participate in what's going on. And he says that one of the saddest things is these days people might come to a funeral home to witness a funeral service, but then when it's time to go to the cemetery, everybody leaves. And so there were 100 people at the funeral, and there's 14 at the cemetery, and he would scratch his head. And Lynch contrasts that with in Ireland, how death happens in Ireland, and how that, you know, if Aunt Eleanor had died in Ireland, the whole community would be walking with them to the cemetery. They would stay there. They would put the dirt in the grave. They talk a lot about that too, about how even at cemeteries, the real act of burial happens after the people leave. And he's wondering, why do we do that? And that's why he would say we need to reclaim and redeem the funeral. Now, the cemeteries would say it's a liability issue. And that's what people have been told. We don't want people there throwing dirt down there, and that's not how we do it. And he said, but if it's something you feel strongly about, you certainly can be part of that process, even if it's just standing off to a side and watching. But really, I mean, in the funerals that I've done and in the funerals that I've gone to in recent years, really, if you're at the graveside, you say a few prayers, and then everybody turns and walks away. You get them safely in their cars, and then the big crane comes out to do the rest of the work. And it's something that's a norm now in our society, and both of these gentlemen would say, perhaps we need to rethink that norm and look at what might be more appropriate here. And so they even talk about the symbolism of, there was one clergy person who wanted to put dirt on the grave, and they gave him dirt like in a little cheese shaker thing. And he was like, excuse me? So he took the top off and took it in his hands to really do the symbolism of that. So there's some interesting things that I think are debatable and questionable. I don't think that what is written here is 100%, this is what we must do now. They're absolutely right. I think a lot of it is open for debate. I think when you look at the whole difference between a memorial service and a funeral service with a body present, well, what are the extenuating circumstances? What are the reasonings? I believe a memorial service really can be powerful and meaningful and solemn and joyful, all at the same time. Without a body there, they would say that that's excluding the guest of honor. And so it gets into some of the issues, I think, of the importance of a body in terms of acknowledging that the death has certainly occurred. They talk a lot about what happened at 9/11 and in some of our wars when people know that their loved one has died and there's no body. And so they don't know then how to hold a service or honor their life and their death and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting dichotomy as we start to think about it in terms of, oh, it doesn't matter if the body's there or not. Wait a minute. If someone I loved was killed in 9/11 or in a war and they told me I would never have access to that body again, all of a sudden the body becomes very, very important. So in that sense, the book, I think, is wonderful in terms of opening us up to saying, what are some of the nuances here? What are some of the things that maybe I might want to talk about or think about? Is it important for me to see the body of the person that I love there or not? And if not, why? Because they would say if it's for convenience sake or because it's too hard, then you have to really step back and ask yourself, are those valid reasons? Because the fact is, grief hurts. Losing someone we love hurts. It's hard. It's not easy to get through it. But to take the body away isn't something that's going to make it easier. At least that's part of their premise. So they address issues such as that. The other thing is this book is truly written from a Christian perspective. And that's important as you read the book, or if you're thinking, oh, I have a friend I might want to recommend this book to. It's really written from a Christian perspective. They bring in some wonderful stories about people of other faiths, particularly Judaism and Buddhism. Talk a lot about that, and so they expand it. But this truly is from the perspective of Christians who believe that death is an ending, but not the end, and that there is a life after death, and so there is a continued journey even after death. So people who don't come from that Christian perspective may read this with either some real skepticism or with, wait, this doesn't apply at all because I don't understand. However, that said, they use, for example, the Buddhist tradition and the Hindu tradition of cremation as a real example of honoring the body, because in those traditions, the family carries the body to the pyre. The oldest son lights the match that sets it on fire, and they stay until the fire has consumed the body. And because part of their premise is that the body must be present and treated with respect, that those are traditions that we need to look at, and how can we in our technologically advanced country do something like that. He talks about going with an Episcopalian priest to a crematory and sitting there for the 3 hours that it took to have a body burned. He says that he will always ask the family, and they react to him like they're asking him, them to go watch surgery or something. That's something people don't want to do at all. And I mean, it's understandable. And at the same time, I think they raise some interesting questions about it. That if we're willing to take the body to the graveside and have the casket lowered into the ground and have that be a final farewell, if cremation is what we choose, why would we treat that as any different? Is it harder to actually see the casket going into the oven, that type of thing? And quite frankly, in our area, I don't know how it would be received if, for example, I said, I would like to accompany this person to the crematorium and I want to be present there. I simply don't know the answer to that. It would be something interesting to look into for people. They say that there's 4 elements that are definitive elements of a funeral. And they would argue that without these elements, it's not a funeral. And the first one for them is the presence of the dead. The body has to be there. The second is the presence of those to whom the death matters. So family, friends, the gathering of people. The third is there has to be some narrative And for them, they would say the religious service, the readings, that type of thing, that talk about what this death means. What it means in the big picture of life and what it means for the gathered group who loved this person or knew this person who died. And then the fourth thing is it has to accomplish the disposition of the dead. So they see it very, very clearly that whether the body is then going to a crematorium or to a cemetery, you have to be part of that process. It's part of the journey. It's part of the healing that can begin and that type of thing. It's controversial because there are people who would say absolutely not. You can take care of that. Some of what they suggest in terms of redeeming some of it for ourselves is interesting because it's items that the funeral industry and our laws have taken away from us. So when they talk about preparing the body, well, we have some pretty stringent laws about what a family member can or cannot do. When they talk about burial, they're not going to let you bury your loved one under a tree in your backyard. They just, that's not the law of the land. It's not sanitary. It's not, they can give the whole list. So it is also, it's a little interesting to me how they talk about reclaiming what we've lost, and yet much of what we've lost is because of the funeral industry and the laws of the land. And so how do you have it both ways? I'm not sure if you can, but I do think that there might be some ways that we can start doing things like, I know more and more hospitals are inviting a family member to say, do you want to wash their body before the funeral home comes? As a way of doing a final thing. For many people, they're like, whoa, I never thought of it, yes. And for many people, it's like, no, too hard. And so we have to be careful not to judge people for that, because it truly is, when someone's in the midst of that kind of grief, it's like, okay, how do we help them be in the grief, but not be forcing them to do things that might be way too difficult at that moment? However, I think offering is fine, because we certainly don't want to leave somebody 2 weeks later saying, oh, if somebody had told me that I could have, washed her hair one more time, I would have loved to have done that. So it's that delicate balance. When they talk about the funeral service itself, they had an interesting thing in terms of that, why they don't think that the memorial service, they make a clear distinction between a funeral and a memorial service. Sometimes I think we use that language interchangeably. For them, a funeral is, the body is there, the procession is started, you're walking with the body from one place to another, and it ends with the body in its final resting place, whether it's at a crematorium or in the ground or that kind of thing. A memorial service, they would say, is something that happens without the body there. It could still be the day after the death, but they would call it a memorial service if the body wasn't there. And they say that we've lost the mystery of the Christian funeral when we only do memorial services. And they talk about that a memorial service replaces theology with therapy. It's interesting. Conviction with convenience, and assurances of faith with, and this was a little hard to read, assurances of faith with memorial karaoke, where everyone shares a memory of the person, which I could have a long discussion with people about that, because I think sharing memories is part of how we start to heal. And yet, I think what they're saying is that when that's all it is just a sharing of memories, then we've lost the mystery. And we've lost the solemnity that needs to be there in terms of the meaning of this death. So a celebration of life would be, let's talk about the meaning of their life and how grateful we are that this person was part of our life and we were able to be part of their life. But a funeral might include that, but would also add God's promise of being with us from life through death into life eternal. and they really feel that that has been lost, and they convict themselves. They convict funeral directors, they convict clergy in terms of allowing that to happen. One of the other strong things that they talk about, and then I think we'll be drawing this to a close a little bit, is Thomas Lynch really feels that a funeral director should be called an undertaker. And so does the clergy person. They say we are undertaking a calling to help people walk through this journey of grief. So Thomas Lynch would say, tell a funeral director you don't want him or her directing you. You don't want him or her telling you how to do this, how to grieve, what needs to be where, when, and why. But you need them to undertake a job which will help you get this person who you love from place A to place B with meaning and providence within it. So that it's an interesting, again, an interesting nuance to read in the book and start looking at and saying, and they also refer to the casket as the coffin. And when I did that once, I had a funeral director very, very angrily say, it's a casket. Okay. and so I think they're trying to get back to some older language, and I think some of the funeral directors that I know don't want to be called undertakers. I think they think that that has a different connotation to it. But when you read it in this book in terms of the connotations, it's really quite interesting. That's the basic overall quick view of the book. Like I said, I would recommend it, but I would want people who read it to be able to talk about it afterwards, because some of the things really raise some issues for me and some concerns about being almost too black and white and saying, oh, it has to be this, and it doesn't give enough of understanding or background of why, maybe sometimes convenience does have to have a higher spot than something else because of the situation of the family. And I would have liked to have seen more of that, I guess a little more pastoral energy in the book, saying each family and each individual is different, and so how can we address the needs of that family and that individual? So that's basically my thoughts about the book. And so now questions. I guess we have time for questions. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
What about when you have a memorial with the urn there, the ashes and everything?
They would say that that's better than nothing, but that they really feel the body should be there. Yes.
I think without the body, that people have a lot of problems with closure, of really knowing that, okay, this is the end. And a lot of times, months after that is when it affects them so much more deeply, because they didn't have that closure of having the body there.
Of being able to see the body and visit, and being able to internalize and say, yes, this person who I loved is dead. I can't pretend that he or she isn't because I'm looking at their body. Yeah. Yes.
Did they speak any about donating your body to a hospital?
Not at all. Mm-hmm. Not at all. And that's a piece that for me would have been very helpful to have. I'm a staunch advocate of organ donation and that type of thing. And they did not address it at all. Yes?
I just wanted to say, I think when you began, at least I thought you were going to kind of compare the funeral of yesterday to where it's come to today. I simply wanted to comment that when I was a little boy, I think we probably all went through the same thing. One of my playmates' grandfather or grandmother died. And in the afternoon, I think before the funeral itself began, or the wake, I should say, we were allowed into the living room of the home, and the body lied at rest there. And I always thought that was a little odd, although maybe that's what it was done, how it was done years ago.
It is,
but
yeah.
I just always felt that was strange because there was Eddie's grandfather lying where the Christmas tree would be. You know?
Right. But that is how it used to be, and that is one of the reasons why death was dealt with in a very different way in earlier years, because it was so a part of life. The person was waked in the living room. The kids were there. It was part of just daily life. And the body was respected because usually someone would sit with the body even overnight. So it was always attended. But yeah, they're not suggesting that we go back to that, but I think they're trying to reclaim some of that.
Yeah, at the turn of the century, I was at a garage sale. It was very common to have a professional photographer take pictures
Yes.
of the deceased and it would be displayed for a year or so in the house.
Right.
But that's also coming back. A lot of people are doing that. I've been to several funerals where people have taken pictures of the person in the casket. So that is coming back. A lot of this, I'm going to take a time. I want to thank you for doing this because I think it's fabulous and I love to hear you talk. And I love Thomas Lynch. So I'm very appreciative for this book because I think that we do have to start looking at, where we've come from and what we need to do, because the fact is we do. We don't want to think about death. We don't want to look at death. When we talk about it, people, like you said, people just like, oh, I don't want to talk about it. But nobody gets out of here alive. And if we all talk about it, then it's not so scary. And the funerals are a ritual for people to begin to heal. We talked about 9/11. I have a friend of mine who lost her brother-in-law, and they never recovered his body. To this day, his mother will not say that he's gone, even though we know that he's gone, because she had never seen a body. So there is a lot of importance to have a body. And I think that we should start looking at funerals as something differently than just a money pit, as it were, because I hear from a lot of people. So I thank you for coming here, and I thank you for having this book, and I'm excited about it.
Thank you. The 9/11 stories that they share, they talk about why the work after 9/11 of the sifting through the debris and even finding the smallest bone, and how families would be so grateful if they even got just a fragment of something that they could be sure through DNA testing that it was their loved one, because they felt then they had something to lay to rest. So, yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I've got two pictures. One of my grandfather in a casket in the living room, grandmother, and one of my wife's, my aunt in a casket. Way back in early 1900s.
Right.
I have to tell you, the first time in modern day age, when I was at a funeral and saw someone taking a picture of their loved one in the casket, I was horrified. I really was. I thought, why would they even want to do that? And then okay. It's part of the memory of the person. So again, I don't think it's about right or wrong. I think it's about what the family needs at that point and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I have one.
Sure.
Did they speak at all about the cemetery, if one is interned? Did they speak at all about how people visit and care for that at all?
No, they really didn't. Truly, the focus was the body and taking care of the body. So it wasn't, the only thing they addressed about the cemetery was how it has become sanitized and how oftentimes you don't even go to the grave site. You're at a little pavilion or something if it's snowy or if it's rainy or anything. And they would say, no, you need to be where it's happening. So they did address that very briefly. Yeah.
So would you suggest this book to your students?
Oh, I would. Yes, because I think the conversation you could have around it, because there are some things in here that I think you might read and say, there is no way, what are they talking about? And so I think whenever a book can do that, it's a good read because it makes you think about things. And I tell you, I've taught in bereavement studies for 13 years, and I never thought I knew it all, but I thought I had really read a lot. And when I was reading some of this, I was really in a conundrum some of the times thinking, wait a minute, is that, can I buy into that? Do I want to? Why would I? Why don't I want to? So I think whenever a book can do that, it's worth reading. Yeah, it got a little redundant for me in terms of the writing styles and the back and forth. And like I said, I couldn't understand why they were quoting one another. I mean, they were each writing the book, so why quote one another? And that's when I felt it was kind of like this mutual fan club kind of thing going on. So some of it, I think, could have been pared down a bit, but it's an easy read. It's not difficult to read. And yeah. And back there, yeah.
I had a question about, when you talked about some hospitals are permitting family members, which I think is a wonderful, it's like a little final service you can do for your family member or your friend or whoever is in the hospital. Did they talk about any specific hospitals that were using this, giving permission for this?
No, they didn't. But in my work in a couple local hospitals, I've witnessed it happening. Yeah. I think it's one of those things, if people become unafraid to ask, so that sometimes the nurses are right on top of it and will say, would you like to help? But it's not part of their practice. It's really changing the paradigm of how we think about that. But I think that if a family member, I think probably at most of the hospitals, if a family member were to say, I would really like some time alone with him, it's really important, can I bathe him for the last time? I would be hard-pressed to find a reason why they would say no to that. I mean, the only time they would is if it were a coroner's case. It was somebody in the emergency room, and then, of course, we have to treat the body a bit differently. But otherwise, I think that can be a very gentle, peaceful kind of start of saying goodbye. Yeah.
Even the nursing homes, I recently had a client in the nursing home who had passed away, and her mother had asked if she could stay in the room with her daughter until her brother had come down from Syracuse. And we were in the room for 6 hours. Mm-hmm. And they would just come in periodically and just check, is everything all right? And that was fine until the brother came down. And then after the brother had time with his sister, then they called the funeral director. So that was very nice. I mean, they're very accepting.
Right.
If you just ask the question, is it possible that I can do this?
Right. Yeah. I think that is important. I think the reality is we all grieve differently and need different things to help us on this journey. When they do touch on grief in the book, they do touch a little bit about how again, we often will try to quelch a person's grief, and he talks about a funeral in which it was the daughter of a woman, and when the woman came in and saw her in the casket for the first time, she was understandably distraught and fell apart. And the funeral director said, "Oh, here, I'll take you over to a side room." And it's like, wait a minute, why? What is more natural than a mother falling apart, and so what we as a society need to be able to do more is say, what, it's okay. Let her howl and grieve right now. That's part of this. She's going to get back to where she needs to be, maybe in 10 minutes, maybe in an hour, but to make it somehow that it's wrong, that you're having that intensity of feelings, I think is a big disservice. And I think we need to help people feel a little more. It's scary because we don't know what to say. We want to make people feel better, and we're in a situation where we can't. And so how do we help them be in their grief? That could be another book.
It goes along with giving people medication after somebody dies, and I think it's known because it delays the grief and sort of allowing them to begin the really, really terrible work the first days of trying to make sense of it all, and you just sedate it, and I think you do them a very great disservice.
Yeah. Did you have
I wonder how cemeteries would feel if you requested that they not have machinery at the gravesite and the personnel. I'm saying that because when my husband died, my one daughter said the last remembrance that she has is looking over and seeing like the 3 men standing and one at the machine waiting. I don't remember that, but she does.
Right.
And she said it has bothered her. But of course, for them, it's a job, and they have to get it done, and so on and so forth. But it's a thought. might stop in the office down there and tell them when I go, I don't want the machine there or the people.
You know, and that is how change happens, and it's a slow process, and they might have some very valid reasons that we don't understand at all, but I think it's a conversation worth having. Yeah. Yes?
What's the meaning of, well, I guess once the casket has been lowered, people, you know, they throw the scoop of dirt. I mean, is that just a ritual?
Yes.
To begin the burial, I suppose.
It is, and it's also an acknowledgement as part of the ritual, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And in modern day times, it would also be, I think people would say it is a way that the family, those gathered, can feel that they're doing something as an absolute final action that they can do instead of just leaving the casket on top of the ground and they turn and walk away. It's part of the reality because, again, in olden days, the family would be there with the shovels and covering the cat. They wouldn't leave until it was covered. So it's symbolic and it's part of ritual.
What's the symbolism of putting stones on the gravestone or even coins? I think
That is a wonderful Jewish tradition. And it started in Israel because, and I think I'm speaking correctly about this, to put flowers, they wouldn't last. And so they would die. Whereas if stones were placed, they were more permanent. And then when the family went to to visit the gravesite, they would know, oh, people came and visited. And then often, as part of the tradition, once the family had been there, they would remove the stones. And then as new visitors came, they would start putting them back on. So it's a way of honoring the person and letting the family know that someone has been to visit.
But I think I've also seen coins. Is that the same thing?
I think it might be.
Okay.
Yeah. Something tangible that can be left. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a law that you have to have an autopsy done?
No. If you die at home unattended and you're not under a doctor's care, they might require an autopsy. If there's been an accident, they might require an autopsy. If you are in the hospital for something and you die, an autopsy is not required. Some families will request it because perhaps there's something hereditary going on that they would like to have addressed and have a better idea. Or if the person had a very complicated illness and everybody's confused about what was really going on, sometimes the family will say, a doctor will approach and say, you know, would you like an autopsy? Actually, a physician or nurse has to ask every person if they would like an autopsy at the time of death. They
also required that they be embalmed? Is there a law about that?
I can't address that 100% because I've been reading some different things. That if you're buried within a certain amount of time that you don't have to be embalmed. I don't know what New York state law is, so I really can't address that.
Isn't it that you have to be involved if you want a viewing, but you're not if you have?
I think so.
I think that's New York state law. Unless they've changed it, that's what it's always been. Is that you have to be involved if you're going to have a viewing.
I think so.
You can have.
Time frame, though, isn't it?
No, it's because of the fact they don't have somebody. But my brother died in 1988, and he had AIDS, so they wouldn't embalm him at all. So we couldn't even have an open casket. It was very horrendous. They wouldn't embalm him. They wouldn't clothe him. Yeah, it was
I'm
bad.
sorry, that's bad.
Yeah, it was a bad time. And so they wouldn't even do it.
Mm-hmm. Thankfully, things have changed in terms of that. But yeah. Anything else?
Paula, thanks for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. This was fun. Thank you.